Welcome to Dark Marriage Secrets, the place where love stories take a dark turn and happily ever after becomes nothing more than an illusion. Tonight, we ask a haunting question. Can love transform into a death sentence, even in the sweetness of a honeymoon? This is not just another true crime tale. This is the story of a young couple who had everything ahead of them. A wedding filled with smiles, a honeymoon filled with promises, and a future painted with dreams. But behind the closed doors of their honeymoon suite, something unthinkable happened. One life ended, another life fell apart, and the truth was buried beneath accusations, betrayal, and silence. In this episode, we step inside the chilling case known as the deadly honeymoon murder, where love, trust, and loyalty were shattered in the most horrifying way. Was it passion turned into violence? Was it betrayal disguised as devotion? Or was it a plan carefully crafted from the very beginning? Let's uncover the secret, together. They met like so many young couples do, unexpectedly, yet at the perfect time. Sarah was 25, bright, ambitious, with a smile that seemed to light up every room she entered. Mark was a few years older, confident, charming, the kind of man who could make strangers feel like old friends. Their worlds collided at a friend's dinner party, where laughter was loud and wine flowed easily. But in the middle of all the noise, it was only each other they noticed. That night marked the beginning of a love story that seemed destined for forever. Friends would later recall how inseparable they became. Weekend getaways, late-night talks that stretched until dawn, whispered promises of always and forever. To outsiders, their love appeared pure, almost enviable. Within a year, Mark proposed. He did it under a canopy of fairy lights, down on one knee, with Sarah's favorite song playing softly in the background. She said yes through tears, her voice trembling with joy. Their engagement photos captured them laughing, kissing, gazing into each other's eyes, with the certainty that they had found their soulmate. The wedding was straight out of a storybook. White roses lined the aisle, candles flickered as vows were exchanged, and the couple sealed their promises with a kiss that drew thunderous applause. For many, it felt like the perfect beginning. Two souls uniting in front of God, family, and friends. There was no hint, not even a shadow, of what was to come. But love, as history often reminds us, can be fragile. As the reception continued into the night, guests noticed subtle differences in how the two carried themselves. Mark, always eager to be the center of attention, soaked in the spotlight with charm and wit. Sarah, radiant in her gown, smiled beside him but seemed quieter than usual, her laughter sometimes forced, her eyes lingering just a second too long on the champagne glass in her hand. It was a detail too small to matter that night, yet haunting in retrospect. Their honeymoon was supposed to be a dream, the golden chapter after the fairy tale wedding. A luxury resort by the ocean, days filled with sunshine, nights filled with passion. They packed carefully, choosing outfits for candlelit dinners, beach walks, and photographs to share on social media with the caption, "Just married, just us." On the plane, Sarah leaned her head on Mark's shoulder, whispering about the children they would one day have, the house with a garden, the future they were so eager to build. Mark kissed her forehead, smiled, and told her she was all he ever wanted. To anyone watching, they were the picture of young love, brimming with possibility. But sometimes, beneath the sweetness of words, there lies an undertone too faint to recognize in the moment. Sarah's diary, later discovered, would reveal flickers of unease, mentions of arguments that ended with silence rather than resolution, feelings of being overshadowed by Mark's larger-than-life personality. She loved him deeply, but the question lingered. Did he love her the same way? Or did he love the image of them more than the woman beside him? Still, none of this was visible to the world. To their families and friends, Sarah and Mark were a match made in heaven. The honeymoon photos would capture smiles under the sun, champagne glasses raised, arms wrapped tightly around each other. Yet if one looks closely, behind Sarah's perfect smile, there's a flicker in her eyes, a glimmer of doubt or perhaps fear. And it is here, in this delicate space between love and uncertainty, that the tragedy began to take root. The honeymoon, a time meant for intimacy and joy, would instead become the stage for betrayal, violence, and a secret too dark to remain hidden forever. The honeymoon destination was everything Sarah had dreamed of. a secluded coastal resort perched above turquoise waters, the kind of place travel magazines called paradise on Earth. White sand stretched endlessly, waves lapped gently at the shore, and palm trees swayed like dancers under the warm evening breeze. For newlyweds, it was the perfect backdrop. Sunsets painted in fiery colors, candlelit dinners by the beach, and the promise of unforgettable nights. To the staff and other guests, Mark and Sarah looked like the embodiment of romance. They held hands as they walked barefoot along the shoreline, posed for photographs with their arms entwined, and toasted champagne with radiant smiles. Yet beneath the glittering surface, there were cracks invisible to strangers' eyes. On their third night, neighbors in the next villa reported hearing raised voices. A woman's tone, sharp, almost trembling, echoed through the thin walls, followed by a man's low, commanding response. The argument seemed to die down quickly, replaced by silence, and then laughter that sounded just a little too forced. Newlywed nerves, one guest remarked. But for Sarah, those nerves were becoming something else entirely, a gnawing sense of unease. According to Sarah's later testimony, the arguments were not isolated. She claimed Mark had grown controlling, questioning her every action. "Why did you look at the waiter that way?" he allegedly asked one evening. Another time, she said he accused her of flirting with a photographer who had offered to take their picture on the beach. Mark, on the other hand, painted an entirely different story. In his version, Sarah was the one who had become distant. He told police she drank too much, that she acted strangely when night fell, and that her temper was unpredictable. He described her as unstable, even hinting that she might have been suffering from some hidden emotional breakdown. The resort staff noticed tension too, though none could point to anything overtly alarming. A waitress recalled Sarah requesting a separate glass of wine after refusing to share a bottle with Mark. A bellboy remembered Sarah's trembling hands as she signed a receipt. At the time, these seemed trivial. Later, they would become critical pieces of a much darker puzzle. The tragedy unfolded on their sixth night. Police reports state that shortly after midnight, resort security was alerted by a frantic call from Mark. His voice was panicked. "My wife, she's not breathing." Guards rushed to the villa and found Sarah lying motionless on the marble floor near the bathroom. Her head bore a deep wound, and broken glass glittered around her like cruel confetti. Mark told the officers that Sarah had slipped after drinking heavily, crashing into the glass table before collapsing. He claimed he had tried to revive her but found no pulse. His white shirt was stained with blood, his hands trembling as he insisted, "It was an accident. She just fell." Yet, inconsistencies quickly emerged. The medical examiner noted that the wound on Sarah's head was not consistent with a simple fall. It appeared blunt, forceful, deliberate. Furthermore, traces of sedatives were discovered in her bloodstream, a detail Mark could not explain. When questioned further, Mark's account shifted. At first, he insisted Sarah had been drinking heavily, stumbling and clumsy. Later, when pressed about the sedatives, he claimed she had been depressed, perhaps even suicidal, and may have taken the pills herself. But Sarah had left behind fragments of her own story. Hidden in her travel bag, detectives found a small diary. In the final entry, written just a day before her death, she penned, "I don't feel safe. He isn't the man I thought I married. If something happens to me, it won't be an accident." This discovery changed everything. Suddenly, the picture of a tragic accident began to look like something far more sinister. Prosecutors began to build a case of premeditated murder, painting Mark as a manipulative husband who lured his bride into marriage only to dispose of her during their honeymoon. But Mark fought back. Through his lawyers, he insisted the diary was a fabrication, or at least a distortion of reality. He argued that Sarah had struggled with anxiety for years, that her words were born of paranoia, not truth. His defense team portrayed him as a devastated husband, wrongfully accused while grieving the love of his life. The media erupted with speculation. Headlines screamed honeymoon horror and from wedding bells to funeral bells. Talk shows dissected every detail. The diary, the sedatives, the conflicting testimonies. Was Sarah a victim of a cold-blooded killer, or was Mark the target of a cruel misunderstanding? Witness testimonies only deepened the mystery. A tourist claimed she saw the couple arguing heatedly by the pool hours before Sarah's death. Another guest swore Sarah had been crying during dinner that night. but others contradicted these accounts, saying the couple looked affectionate, even inseparable. The trial would later hinge on these contradictions. Sarah had accused Mark indirectly through her diary. Mark accused Sarah directly through his words, painting her as unstable and reckless. Each side wielded its version of the truth like a weapon. And in the center of it all lay the haunting question. Was this the tragic end of a troubled love, or the calculated act of a murderer hiding behind the mask of a grieving husband? The investigation began almost immediately. Local police sealed off the villa where Sarah's body had been found, photographing every corner, bagging every shard of glass, every blood-stained towel, every trace of what could be evidence. What was supposed to be a honeymoon suite now looked like a crime scene from a grim textbook. Overturned furniture, the faint smell of alcohol, and a woman's life abruptly stolen. At first, detectives treated Mark as a grieving husband. He sat with his head in his hands, shaking uncontrollably, repeating, "It was an accident. She slipped." Officers noted his distress, but also noticed something odd. Despite his emotional display, his eyes often darted toward the officers' notes, as if carefully measuring their reactions. The medical examiner's findings pushed the case into darker territory. Sarah's head injury showed clear signs of blunt force trauma. The angle and depth did not match a simple fall against the glass table. The sedatives in her system complicated matters further. They were strong enough to impair movement, but the dosage suggested she hadn't taken them willingly. When confronted, Mark's story began to unravel. Initially, he insisted Sarah had been drunk. When told about the sedatives, he shifted. She must have taken them herself. She wasn't happy. She was unpredictable. Days later, his lawyers refined the story again. Sarah had been depressed for years, and her diary where she had written about not feeling safe was merely a reflection of her unstable mind. But investigators were unconvinced. Sarah's friends, contacted back home, gave a different picture. They described her as optimistic, excited for marriage, and looking forward to starting a family. One friend swore Sarah had texted her the day before leaving for the honeymoon. "I'm happy, but something about him feels strange. I'll tell you everything when I get back." That message never got the chance to be explained. The resort staff became crucial witnesses. A waitress testified that Sarah had quietly asked if there was a pharmacy nearby, whispering that she needed something for anxiety. The bellboy remembered her trembling as she signed for room service, her eyes darting nervously toward Mark. Another staff member revealed she had overheard Sarah saying, "I don't want to fight anymore," followed by the sound of a door slamming. But Mark's defense team countered each point. They claimed Sarah had always suffered from anxiety, that her requests were consistent with someone struggling mentally. They reminded investigators that honeymoons, though idealized, often carried stress, and that marital disputes were not uncommon. Still, the evidence against Mark deepened. Forensic experts discovered fingerprints on the broken glass table that suggested the pieces had been moved after the fall. The blood spatter pattern also hinted that Sarah had been struck before hitting the floor. A crucial twist came when hotel surveillance footage was reviewed. In the hours before Sarah's death, the camera captured Mark leaving the resort twice. Once, late in the evening, he was seen entering a pharmacy in town. Receipts confirmed he had purchased sleeping pills, the same type of sedatives later found in Sarah's system. When confronted with this, Mark hesitated. "They were for me," he claimed. "I couldn't sleep. I was under stress." But investigators noted that he had never mentioned sleep problems before. Public opinion began to fracture sharply. Tabloids splashed headlines like "Groom" or "Grim Reaper," while talk shows debated whether Mark was a manipulative killer or the victim of sensationalism. Online forums exploded with theories. Some believed Sarah's diary was undeniable proof of premeditation. Others argued that it could have been written in a moment of paranoia, feeding into the narrative of her instability. As weeks passed, the investigation turned into a tug-of-war between two competing realities. On one side, prosecutors built a portrait of Mark as a calculating man who married Sarah for personal gain, whether financial inheritance, insurance, or simply control. They argued that the sedatives, the staged accident, and the diary formed a chilling mosaic of premeditated murder. On the other side, The defense painted Sarah as a troubled woman whose mental health struggles led to a tragic accident. They leaned heavily on Mark's public grief, the absence of direct eyewitnesses to the act itself, and the inconsistencies in how stress can warp perception. Even the witnesses contradicted one another. One tourist insisted she saw Mark grab Sarah's arm violently near the pool the night before her death. Another claimed she saw them dancing together just hours later, laughing as though they were deeply in love. Which version was true? For detectives, the case became a labyrinth of half-truths. Each time Mark was pressed, his story adjusted slightly, bending around the new evidence. To some, this was the behavior of a guilty man. To others, it was the natural reaction of someone overwhelmed, cornered, and desperate to explain what he could not fully control. By the time the case reached the courts, the public was deeply divided. Was Mark a grieving husband whose life had been shattered by tragedy, now persecuted unfairly? Or was he a cold manipulator who turned love into a weapon and marriage into a death sentence? The only certainty was that the truth had died with Sarah in that villa. What remained were fragments: a broken table, a blood-stained shirt, a diary filled with desperate words, and a man whose guilt or innocence would forever remain tangled in suspicion. The courtroom was silent the day the verdict was read. After weeks of testimony, conflicting stories, and endless media speculation, everyone waited to hear the final word. Some jurors believed the evidence pointed clearly to guilt: the sedatives, the stage scene, the haunting diary entry left behind by Sarah. Others hesitated, swayed by the defense's arguments that depression, stress, and marital pressure could have pushed Sarah toward her own downfall. In the end, the decision was not unanimous. The trial ended in a mistrial, leaving the case suspended in uncertainty. For Mark, it meant freedom, at least for now. For Sarah's family, it meant no closure, only endless nights replaying her last words, her last text messages, her last moments alive. The world moved on, but the shadows of this case never faded. To this day, true crime communities continue to debate it. Was Sarah's death the result of a tragic accident, an unraveling marriage pushed over the edge, or was it the perfect crime executed under the cover of paradise? And so, the story of Mark and Sarah remains suspended in the twilight between love and betrayal, life and death, truth and lies. Perhaps the most chilling part of all is how ordinary it seemed at first. Two people in love, a dream honeymoon, a life together just beginning. Yet within days, it all crumbled into suspicion and blood. If it could happen to them, could it happen to anyone? Now, we turn the question to you. Who do you believe? Was Mark a grieving husband, wrongfully accused of a crime he did not commit? Or was Sarah's diary her final plea for justice, pointing to a man who turned vows of love into a weapon of control and death? Tell us in the comments below. Your voice matters because sometimes, in cases like these, the truth lives on only in the questions we dare to ask.